The three Los Zetas sicarios had already been through hell. Their bodies were broken, bloodied, and battered, the results of hours of torture at the hands of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. But their suffering was far from over. After days exposed to the blistering Mexican sun, they were loaded into a truck and driven deep into the wilderness. As his men built a bonfire, El Chapo stepped forward, rifle in hand. He looked to the tear-streaked faces of the hitmen, cursed each one of them, and then pulled the trigger. One by one, their lifeless bodies hit the dirt. His men dragged them into the fire. As flames consumed the corpses, El Chapo spat on them before turning away. "Burn them well," he said. "I don't want there to even be bones left in the morning." And if you can believe it, this was one of the more tame crimes of the Sinaloa Cartel, one of the most powerful, ruthless, and wealthy drug organizations in Mexico. You've probably heard their name before, but today on the Infographic Show, we're diving deeper than ever into the dark, violent world of Mexico's deadliest cartel. While El Chapo's name you probably most associate with the Sinaloas, the organization's existence can be owed to someone else, Pedro Aviles Perez. Aviles was a pioneering drug runner known by the frightening nickname the Mountain Lion and much less frightening nickname Sneaky Pete. He was nothing if not a savvy businessman, and he built up the beginnings of what would later become the Sinaloa Cartel through a plucky weed smuggling operation back in the 1960s. What was unique about Aviles wasn't what he smuggled, but how he smuggled it. He was the first recorded Mexican drug runner to use aircraft to smuggle contraband into the United States. This put him head and shoulders above his competition at the time, and it made him an extremely wealthy man, with an increasingly wealthy organization behind him. His early start earned him the rare title of first-generation Mexican drug trafficker, and two people who worked under him, Rafael Caro Quintero and Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, would carry forward and refine the methods that Aviles innovated. Aviles himself got zeroed by Mexican federals in 1978, a move rumored to be part of an orchestrated power grab by Carrillo. Intentional or not, Carrillo and Quintero wasted no time capitalizing on the power vacuum. Along with Felix Gerardo, they formed the terrifying Guadalajara Cartel, the organization that would go on to dominate Mexico's drug trade throughout the 1980s. With virtually no one to stop them, they trafficked weed, cocaine, heroin, and more, raking in obscene amounts of cash. As long as they funneled a small portion of their fortune into the right government hands, they were untouchable. Things were going well for the gaggle of thieves and killers that made up the Guadalajara syndicate, until their lust for money and power at any costs had them fly just a little too close to the sun. Specifically, with the brutal murder of American Drug Enforcement Agency member Agent Enrique Kiki Camarena Salazar in 1985. The murder of Agent Kiki was one of revenge and intimidation. In 1984, a DEA tip-off allowed the Mexican army to find and torch a massive Guadalajara marijuana grow operation, costing the cartel millions. Believing that Kiki's work was the source of the leak, the cartel tracked him down and eventually had some corrupt Mexican police officials kidnap him in broad daylight on February 7, 1985. What followed for Kiki was nothing short of a living nightmare, and it would be the last thing he ever experienced. Kiki was dragged to one of Quintero's residences in Guadalajara, a place that would soon become his prison and torture chamber. Later that same day, he was joined by another captive, pilot Alfredo Zavala Avelar, a man who had flown alongside Kiki on missions and was now about to share his fate. There, the two men would be brutally tortured for 30 straight hours, with their torturers alternating in shifts to inflict maximum pain. They were beaten with rebar and other blunt instruments, breaking ribs and puncturing skulls. The bodies of Kiki and Avelar were also injected with lidocaine. The aim was to keep them awake to fully experience the torture that they were being dealt. In the end, when the Guadalajara men got bored, they riddled the two with bullets, wrapped them in plastic, and then loaded them into the back of a truck. Their corpses would later be found dumped by the roadside. However, killing Kiki turned out to be a disastrous mistake for the Guadalajara cartel. His murder infuriated the DEA and pressured Mexican authorities to crack down harder than ever, not just to seek justice but to avoid losing face. In the years that followed, the cartel's key players, including Gallardo and Quintero, were hunted down and incarcerated. Authorities had cut off the head of the snake, and naturally the body collapsed soon after. By the late 1980s, the once mighty Guadalajara cartel had shattered, splintering into three smaller competing factions. Some of those offshoots formed the Tijuana cartel, but three ambitious Guadalajara veterans, Hector Luis Palma Salazar, Juan Jose Esparragosa, and Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, had bigger plans. Together, they founded the Sinaloa Cartel. And as luck or fate would have it, as the Sinaloa Cartel solidified its position in the early 90s, its founders found themselves stepping into a booming black market for illicit substances. 1993 marked the end of an era with the death of Pablo Escobar and the collapse of his Medellin cartel. Around that same time, a major crackdown on drug trafficking in the Caribbean forced cartels to find new smuggling routes. With both Colombia and the Caribbean effectively removed from play, Mexico emerged as the most viable gateway to the lucrative U.S. drug market. Thanks to America's strict drug laws, demand remained sky high, and for Mexico's cartel, that meant big business. The new kids on the block, the Sinaloa, were eager to expand their market share in this top-dollar business. But there was one big problem facing the Sinaloa Cartel from the outset. In order to get their drugs to the U.S., they needed to move them through the Tijuana corridor, which put them in direct combat with their former Guadalajara allies who had formed the Tijuana Cartel. And things got extremely messy, extremely quickly. If they wanted to win the war against the Tijuana Cartel, they needed an ace up their sleeve, and El Chapo found that ace in Ismael El Mayo Zambada, a man who would later become one of his closest and most valuable allies. El Mayo was a freelance trafficker who was an evil genius when it came to logistics. He had a sixth sense for sniffing out valuable drug trafficking routes and was able to work with and manage other traffickers. With El Mayo on their side, they were able to slowly chip away at their Tijuana rivals in a war of attrition. It seemed like the Sinaloa Cartel were almost destined to win. Drug businesses have a mantra very similar to real estate companies: location, location, location. That's because manufacturing and selling drugs is an extremely geographically sensitive industry. You need the ideal climate as well as plenty of space and cover to cultivate your wares. You also need control over key smuggling routes without the risk of authorities cracking down or your competition heading you off at the pass. In this regard, Sinaloa territory has been a vital component of their massive success. The Sinaloa Cartel's base of operations sat in the heart of Mexico's Golden Triangle, the rugged region where Sinaloa, Durango, and Chihuahua meet. This remote mountainous terrain, fortified by the Sierra Madre Range, provided the perfect stronghold for a criminal empire. From this natural fortress, the cartel expanded rapidly, growing into a multinational powerhouse. At the height of its power, Sinaloa had a presence in at least 21 Mexican states and extended its operations to 50 countries worldwide. Much like Pedro Aviles Perez decades before him, El Chapo set himself apart from the other ex-Guadalajara lieutenants running Sinaloa with his relentless drive for innovation. One of his most infamous breakthroughs was his extensive use of subterranean tunnels for drug smuggling, a technique that he also used to escape prison in 2015. El Chapo was first locked up in 1993 for his crimes, at which point El Mayo continued running the organization and taking its distribution game to new heights. He helped expand the Juarez cartel in this time and began what was almost akin to a corporate merger between the two cartels, weighted to the Sinaloa cartel's benefit overall. In short, things were coming up roses, and the best was yet to come. By 1995, as rival drug lords were being killed or imprisoned, El Chapo had managed to tighten his grip on the Sinaloa cartel, all from behind prison walls. Even locked up, he was calling the shots, using his influence to expand his empire. With rival cartels weakened by leadership losses, he instigated brutal turf wars, seizing their territories piece by piece. Before long, both Tijuana and Juarez had fallen under his control, and Sinaloa's reach had stretched to unprecedented and terrifying new heights. He proved his wiliness yet again when he escaped from prison in 2001 by hiding in a laundry basket. This allowed him to take a more active role in the running of the organization yet again. Another key advantage that set the Sinaloa cartel apart was its willingness to diversify. While older cartels focused primarily on marijuana or cocaine, Sinaloa expanded its product line, transforming itself into a one-stop shop for illicit drugs. Over time, they trafficked marijuana, cocaine, heroin, methamphetamines, and most infamously, fentanyl, the deadly opioid now devastating communities across the U.S. And while they also took in extra profit through money laundering operations, unlike a lot of other cartels, they never extended their business practices to human trafficking. This move was likely more tactical than moral. Human trafficking is a crime that easily unites public outrage, and it would have drawn intense law enforcement scrutiny to the Sinaloa cartel. Avoiding it wasn't about ethics, it was about staying under the radar. And besides, why not stick to what you're good at? Their operational wisdom was paying off. By 2015, they controlled the drug market in almost every Mexican state, giving them annual revenue anywhere from $3 to $39 billion. To put that into perspective, at the high end, the Sinaloa cartel would be making well over the double annual revenue of Trader Joe's. While the Sinaloa cartel is capable of truly stomach-churning acts of violence, and we'll get to those later, they often operated differently from the more openly brutal cartels like Los Zetas and the Juarez cartel. Rather than relying solely on fear and bloodshed, Sinaloa preferred to work in the shadows, using hefty bribes to keep the cops and politicians in line. That strategy held strong until everything changed in 2019, after El Chapo was sentenced to life in an American supermax prison where not even his most loyal allies could reach him. The Sinaloa Cartel has always faced challenges, from law enforcement stings to rival cartels to even their own members splitting away and becoming threats to them. For example, the Beltran Leyva brothers, important members of the Sinaloa operation, split away from the group in 2008 to form the Beltran Leyva organization. They made their animosity clear when they gunned down one of El Chapo's sons, a move that seemed to be retaliation for what they saw as a betrayal. They believed El Chapo hadn't done enough to get one of their brothers out of jail. And after El Chapo's permanent incarceration in the U.S., which was kicked off with his arrest in 2016, internal struggles and warring factions have weakened the cartel's standing. On one side are the Los Chapitos, El Chapo's remaining sons, whose brutality know no bounds. They've been known to torture victims with corkscrews and even feed people to their pet tigers. On the other, El Mayo, the logistical mastermind behind Sinaloa's greatest successes, a man so essential that without him the cartel's empire might never have existed. Though this power struggle may have already been decided by external forces, there are reports that El Mayo, as well as one of El Chapo's sons, Joaquin Guzman Lopez, have been in U.S. custody, incarcerated pending trial as of summer 2024. So, it is reasonable to wonder at this point, what is the state of the Sinaloa Cartel today? What's the structure of its organization and how has it remained in a position of power for so long, while its rival cartels have often been weakened or collapsed? In discussing the Guadalajara cartel earlier, and specifically its collapse, we used the metaphor that once the snake's head is cut off, the body dies. Part of the reason behind the Sinaloa cartel's longevity is that they're less like a snake and more like a whole pit of vipers. The head of the Sinaloa cartel is almost like the President of the United States. They oversee a kind of federal law, and they set the group's primary directive. But rather than the organization being a single mass, it's instead a decentralized collection of smaller territorial organizations. Each of these are capable of acting with a high degree of autonomy, even when the head of the group is trapped in a United States supermax. Each of the cells have a high degree of cooperation, and rather than put their key domestic operatives at risk in international operations, the Sinaloa cartel works with international partners to oversee their interests and operations overseas. Each one of the cells also has an armed contingent, known informally as a mini-army, who defend their turf and carry out their own violent wishes. For example, Los Chapitos operate as one faction, but the mini-army they command is made up of several notorious groups: Los Ninis, the Salazar, Gente Nueva, and the Chimales. At first glance, this seems like a recipe for disaster. After all, these groups are violent, power-hungry, and likely to be on a lot of drugs. But somehow, the Sinaloa cartel has managed to keep the chaos in check, avoiding the kind of internal implosion that has crippled the other cartels. Valentin Perada, an assistant professor at the School of Criminology at the Université de Montréal, has identified the Sinaloa cartel's surprising internal structure as the reason for its relative stability. Unlike other cartels plagued by infighting and betrayal, Sinaloa has maintained order through a democratic process and advanced mediation systems, allowing them to resolve disputes without collapsing into chaos. This approach has kept internal conflicts far less destructive compared to their more volatile rivals. Grievances within the group are often addressed with negotiation and restitution rather than might makes right violence. And of how the group coordinates its cells, Perada said, the cartel has prioritized consensus building amongst its leaders when making pivotal decisions. This unity has enabled the cartel to present a unified front when initiating conflicts or embarking on significant business ventures. For day-to-day decisions, the cartel has also found great success in delegating tasks to its lower-level, local cartel bosses. The drug business, it seems, is not one that benefits from industry leaders being control freaks. Even if he was willing to cut his subordinates some slack, El Chapo was still extremely paranoid throughout his reign. He invested millions into surveillance and spyware technology to both keep his own communications secure while allowing him to spy on everyone else close to him. He said to one friend regarding this attitude, "The most important thing in that environment was to know what everyone was thinking about you. Whoever, your friends, your enemies, your compadres." The Sinaloa cartel's methods of smuggling, conflict mediation, and governance are shockingly sophisticated for a criminal organization. But when it comes to how they treat people on the ground, especially their enemies, their brutality is downright medieval. There's no way to discuss why Sinaloa remains Mexico's deadliest cartel without peering into the utter darkness of the horrific ways they have tortured, killed and brutalized those who stood in their way. Because when negotiation and bribery fail, Sinaloa's real face is revealed. As we alluded to at the start of the video, the cartel's former top dog, El Chapo, is definitely not afraid to personally get his hands dirty. Whether it's tenderizing zetas before throwing them onto a bonfire, or the terrifying brutality that he and his men meted out to rival drug pusher Israel Rincon Martinez. Rincon was captured by Sinaloa enforcers and taken back to one of El Chapo's properties. There, he was brutally tortured by beatings, having electric shocks inside of his ears, and having his teeth pulled out. When Rincon fell unconscious from the sheer levels of pain he was undergoing, El Chapo brought in his personal doctor to patch up and revive Rincon so he could be fully conscious for the rest of his torture. And if that wasn't horrific enough, the entire thing was filmed and then posted onto YouTube before Rincon's dead body was dropped in the streets to rot. Another nightmarish incident saw El Chapo turn his own personal attention to a member of the rival Arellano Felix cartel, with whom he took plenty of time systematically beating and burning all around his body. One witness, a former hitman, said he had burns made with an iron on his back. His shirt was stuck to his skin. He had burns made with a car lighter all over his body. His feet were burned. The man was imprisoned for days while inside a sweltering wooden shack, suffering in the unforgiving heat. When he was finally dragged out, El Chapo stood over him, handgun in hand, pressing for any last scraps of valuable information. Then he pulled the trigger, but that shot wasn't fatal. Still alive, the man was dumped into a shallow grave, bleeding and helpless. El Chapo gave the final order. His men buried the fallen Arellano Felix enforcer alive. And El Chapo's brutality wasn't even all business. During his trial, it came out that he had long been a terror to women and teenage girls under his rule, which feels almost as disgusting as the way he liked to treat his enemies. And the rotten apples don't fall that far from the rotten tree. Los Chapitos are every bit as sadistic as their dad. Los Chapitos maintain a private ranch in Sinaloa, a place where they keep exotic pets and strange, extravagant interrogations, a term that barely scratches the surface of the pure sadism that unfolds there. Here, captured enemies are subjected to horrific cruelty, with Los Chapitos taking their time, ensuring that every moment is as agonizing as possible. Victims have corkscrews twisted into their flesh and muscle, only to have them yanked out with savage force. They are then shocked with cattle prods, their open wounds rubbed with chili juice, and their bodies beaten black and blue, all while their friends, families, and loved ones are threatened in front of them. And once Los Chapitos have extracted every last bit of information, whether their victim is dead or barely clinging to life, their body is tossed into a tiger pit where they're devoured by the cartel's hungry pets. You don't even need to be involved in the cartel drug wars to get an awful death from the Sinaloa forces. Earlier this year, 22-year-old Mexican YouTuber Agustin El Pinky Paul was tortured and interrogated on camera by a hitman linked to the Sinaloa Cartel. His body was found the next day, having been killed by a gunshot, his arms and legs bound. Nestor Isidro Perez Salas, better known as El Nini, served as the security chief for the Sinaloa Cartel. And before his extradition to the US, he was also famed for his terrible brutality. He even had a custom-built murder chamber inside of his home, a room designed purely for torture and execution. The chamber featured restraints to hold victims in place and a drain in the center of the floor, a grim necessity for washing away the copious amounts of blood that would inevitably stain the walls. It might seem like pure barbarism, and on some level it is, but it's also the level of cruelty needed to give the Sinaloa Cartel the edge in the seemingly endless cartel wars. The one immutable truth about all of this is that no matter who wins the cartel wars, it's the innocents caught in the crossfire that really lose. What do you think makes the Sinaloa Cartel so powerful? Their wealth, their brutality, or their ability to evade law enforcement? And do you think any cartel will ever surpass them? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Now go check out the world's most brutal groups, Mexican cartel and others, or watch this instead.